The Common Law, Lecture 2, The Criminal Law. In the beginning of the first lecture, it was shown that the appeals of the early law were directed only to intentional wrongs. The appeal was a far older form of procedure than the indictment, and may be said to have had a criminal as well as a civic aspect. It had the double object of satisfying the private party for his loss and the king for the breach of his peace. On the civil side, it was rooted in vengeance. It was a proceeding to recover those compositions, the first optional, afterwards compulsory, by which a wrongdoer bought the spare from his side. Whether so far as concerned the king, it had the same object, vengeance, or was more particularly directed to revenue, does not matter, since the claim of the king did not enlarge the scope of the action. It would seem to be a fair inference that indicatable offences were originally limited in the same way as those which give rise to an appeal, for whether the indictment arose by splitting up of the appeal or in some other way, the two were closely connected. Acquittal of the appellee on the merits was a bar to an indictment, and on the other hand, when an appeal was fairly started, although the appeller might fail to prosecute or might be defeated by a plea, the cause might still be proceeded with on behalf of the king. The president with the other parent of our criminal procedure and original distinct from the appeal, have origin distinct from the appeal. If, as has been sought, it was merely the successor of a fresh suit, a lynch law, this also is a child of vengeance, even more clearly than the other. The desire for vengeance imports an opinion that its object is actually and personally to blame. It takes an internal standard, not an objective or external one, and condemns its victim by that. The question is whether such a standard is still accepted, either in this primitive form or in some more refined development, as it is commonly supposed. It has seemed not impossible, considering the relative slowness with which the criminal law has improved. It certainly may be argued with some force that it has never ceased to be one object of punishment to satisfy the desire for vengeance. The argument will be made plain by considering those instances in which, for one reason or another, compensation for the wrong is out of the question. Thus, an act may be of such a kind as to make indemnity impossible by putting an end to the principal sufferer, as in the case of a murder or manslaughter. Again, this and other crimes, like a forgery, although directed against an individual, tend to make others feel unsafe, and this general insecurity does not admit of being paid for. Again, there are cases where there are no means of enforcing indemnity. In McLaughley's draft of the Indian Penal Code, breaches of a contract for the carriage of passengers were made criminal. The planquin bearers of Indian were too poor to pay damages, and yet had to be trusted to carry unprotected women and children through wild and desolate tracts, where their desertion would have placed those under the charge in great danger. In all these cases, a punishment remains as an alternative. A pain can be inflicted upon the wrongdoer of a sort which does not restore the injured party to his former situation or to another equally good, but which is inflicted for the very purpose of causing pain. And so far as this punishment takes the place of a compensation, whether on account of the death of a person to whom the wrong was done, the indefinite number of persons afflicted, the impossibility of estimating the worth of the suffering in money or the poverty of the criminal, it may be said that one of its objects is to gratify the desire for vengeance the prisoner pays with his body. The statement may be made stronger still, and it may be said, not only that the law does, but that it ought to make the gratification of revenge an object. This is the opinion, at any rate, of two authorities so great that so opposed in other views, as Bishop Butler and Jeremy Bentham. Sir James Stephen says the criminal law stands to the passion of revenge in much the same relation as marriage to the sexual appetite. The first requirement of a sound body of law is that it should correspond with the actual feelings and demands of the community, whether right or wrong. The people would gratify the passion of revenge outside the law if the law did not help them. The law has no choice but to satisfy the craving itself and thus avoid the greater evil of a private retribution. At the same time, this passion is not one which we encourage, either as private individuals or as lawmakers. Moreover, it does not cover the whole ground. There are crimes which do not excite it, and we should naturally expect that the most important purposes of punishment will be coextensive with the whole field of its application. It remains to be discovered whether such a general purpose exists, and if so, what it is. Different theories still divide opinion upon the subject. It has been thought that the purpose of punishment is to reform the criminal, that is, to deter the criminal and others from committing similar crimes, and that is retribution. Few would now maintain that the first of these purposes was the only one. If it were, every prisoner should be released as soon as it appears clear that he will never repeat his offense, and if he is incurable, he should not be punished at all. Of course, it would be hard to reconcile the punishment of death with this doctrine. The main struggle lies between the other two. On the one side is the notion that there is a mystic bond between wrong and punishment. On the other, that the infliction of pain is only a means to an end. Hegel, one of the great expounders of the former view, puts it in his crazy mathematical form that wrong being the negation of right, punishment is a negation of that negation or retribution. Thus the punishment must be equal in the sense of proportionate to the crime, because its only function is to destroy it. Others without this logical apprentice are content to rely upon a felt necessity that suffering should follow wrongdoing. Apprentice. It's objected that the preventive theory is immoral because it overlooks the ill desert of wrongdoing and furnishes no measure for the amount of punishment, except the lawgiver's subjective opinion in regard to the sufficiency of the amount of preventive suffering. In the language of Kant, it treats man as a thing, not as a person, as a means, not as an end in itself. It's said to be in conflict with the sense of justice and to violate the fundamental principle of all free communities, that is, the members of such community have equal rights to life, liberty, and personal security. In spite of all this, probably most English-speaking lawyers would accept the preventive theory without hesitation. As to the violation of equal rights which is charged, it may be replied that the dogma of equality makes an equation between individuals only, not between an individual and the community. No society has ever admitted that it could not sacrifice individual welfare to its own existence. If conscripts are necessary for its army, it seizes them and marches them with a boy in it in the rear to death. It runs highways and railways through old family places in spite of the owner's protest, paying in this instance the market value, to be sure, because no civilized government sacrifices a citizen more than it can help, but the still sacrificing his will, it is warfare, to that of the rest. If it were necessary to trench further upon the field of morals, it might be suggested that the dogma of equality apply even to individuals only within the limits of ordinary dealings in the common run of affairs. You can't argue with your neighbor except on the admission for the moment that he is as wise as you, although you may by no means believe it. In the same way, you can't deal with him whether we're both afraid to choose, except on the footing of equal treatment, and the same rules for both. The evergreen values set upon peace and the social relation tend to give the law of a social being the appearance of the law of all being. But it seemed to me clear that the ultimate ratio, not only regum, but of private persons, is a force, and that at the bottom of all private relations, however tempered by sympathy and all the social feelings, is justifiable self-preference. If a man is on the plank in the deep sea, which will only float one, and the stranger lay hold of it, he will thrust his mouth if he can. When the state finds itself in a similar position, it does the same thing. The considerations which answer the argument of equal rights also answer the objections to treating man as a thing, and the like. If a man lives in society, he is liable to find himself so treated. The degree of civilization which a people has reached, no doubt, is marked by the anxiety to do as they would be done by. It may be the destiny of a man that his social instincts shall grow to control his actions absolutely, even in antisocial situations. But they have not yet done so, and as the rules of law are, or should be, based upon a morality which is generally accepted. No rule founded on the theory for absolute unselfishness can be laid down without a breach between law and working beliefs. If it be true, and I shall presently try to show that the general principle of criminal and civil liability are the same, it will follow from that alone that the theory and fact agree in frequently punishing those who have been guilty of no moral wrong, and those who could not be condemned by any standard that did not wildly disregard the personal peculiarities of the individual concerned. If punishment stood on the moral ground which I propose for it, the first thing to be considered would be those limitations in the capacity for choosing rightly, which arises from abnormal instincts, want of education, lack of intelligence, and all the other defects which are most marked in the criminal classes. I do not see that they should not be, or at least I did not need to for my argument. I did not say that the criminal law does more good than harm. I only say that it is not enacted or administered on that theory. There remains to be mentioned the affirmative argument in favor of the theory of retribution, to the effect that the fitness of punishment following wrongdoing is axiomatic. It is indistinctly recognized by unperverted minds. Unperverted mind, I think that is will be seen on self-inspection, that this feeling of fitness is absolute and unconditional only in the case of our neighbors. It does not seem to me that anyone who has satisfied himself that an act of his was wrong and that he will never do it again would feel the least need or propriety as between himself and the earthly punishing power alone of his being made to suffer for what he has done, although when third persons were introduced, he might, as a philosopher, admit the necessity of hurting him to frighten others. But when our neighbor do wrong, we sometimes feel the fitness to make them smart for it, whether they had repented or not. The feeling of fitness seemed to me to be only a vengeance in disguise, and I have already admitted that vengeance was an element, though not the chief element, of punishment. But again, the supposed intuitions of fitness does not seem to me to be coextensive with the thing to be accounted for. The lesser punishments are just as fit for the lesser crimes, and the greater for the greater. The demand that crime should be followed by its punishment should therefore be equal and absolute in both. Again, a malam prohibitum is just as much a crime as a malam in se. If there is any general ground for punishment, it must apply to one case as much to the other. But it will hardly be said that if the wrong in the case is supposed consisted of a breach of the revenue laws, and the government had been indemnified for the loss, we should feel any internal necessity that a man who had thoroughly repented of his wrongs should be punished for it, except on the ground that his act was known to others. If it were known, the law would have to verify its threats in order that others might believe and tremble. But if the fact was a secret between the sovereign and the subject, the sovereign, if wholly free from passion, would undoubtedly see that the punishment in such a case was wholly without justification. On the other hand, there can be no case in which the lawmaker makes a certain conduct criminal without his thereby showing a wish and purpose to prevent that conduct. Prevention would accordingly seem to be the chief and only universal purpose of punishment. The law threatens certain pains if you do certain things, intending thereby to give you a new motive for not doing them. If you persist in doing them, it has to inflict the pains in order that its threats may continue to be relieved. If this is a true account of the law as it stands, law does undoubtedly treat the individual as a means to an end. It uses him as a tool to increase the general welfare at his own expense. As been suggested above, that this course is perfectly proper. But if it is wrong, our criminal law follows it, and the theory of our criminal law must be shaped accordingly. Further evidence that our law exceeds the limits of retribution and subordinates considerations of the individual to that of the public well-being will be found in some doctrines which cannot be satisfactorily explained on any other ground. The first is that even the deliberate taking of life will not be punished when it is the only way of seeing one's own. This principle is not so clearly established as that it next to be mentioned, but it has the support of a very great authority. If that is the law, it must go on one of two grounds: either that a self-preference is proper in the case supposed, or that even if it is improper, the law cannot prevent it by punishment, because the threat of death in some future time can never be a sufficiently powerful motive to make a man choose death now in order to avoid the threat. If the former ground is adopted, it means that a single person may sacrifice another to himself, and fortiori that a people may. If the latter view is taken by abounding punishment when it can no longer be expected to prevent the act, the law abandons the retributive and adopts the preventive theory. The next doctrine leads to still clearer conclusions. Ignorance of the law is no excuse for breaking it. This substantive principle is sometimes put in the form of a rule of evidence, and everyone is presumed to know the law. It has accordingly been defended by Austin and others on the ground of a different proof. If justice requires the fact to be ascertained, the difficulty of doing so is no ground for refusing to try. But everyone must feel that ignorance of the law could never be admitted as excuse, even if the fact could be proved by sight and hearing in every case. Furthermore, now that parties can testify, it may be doubted whether man's knowledge of the law is any harder to investigate than many questions which are gone into. The difficulty, such as it is, would be met by throwing the burden of proving ignorance on the lawbreaker. The principle cannot be explained by saying that we are not only commanded to abstain from certain acts, but also to find out that we are commanded. For if there were such a second command, it were clear that the guilt of failing to obey it would bear no proportion of that of disobeying the principal command if known. Yet the failure to know would receive the same punishment as the failure to obey the principal law. The true explanation of the rule is the same as that which accounts for the law's indifference to a man's particular temperament, faculties, and so forth. Public policy sacrifices the individual to the general good. It is desirable that the burden for all should be equal, but it is still more desirable to put an end to robbery and murder. It's no doubt true that there are many cases in which the criminal could not have known that he was breaking the law. But to me, the excuse at all would be to encourage ignorance, which the lawmaker had determined to make man know and obey, and just as the individual is rightly overwhelmed by the large interest on the other side of the scales. If the foregoing argument are sound, it is already manifest that the liability to punishment cannot be finally and absolutely determined by considering the actual personal unworthiness of the criminal alone. Then a consideration will govern only so far as the public welfare permits or demands. And if we take into account the general result which the criminal law intended to bring about, we shall see that the actual state of mind accompanying a criminal act plays a different part from what is commonly supposed. For the most part, the purpose of the criminal law is only to induce external conformity to rule. All law is directed to conditions of things manifest to the senses, and whether it brings those conditions to pass immediately by the use of force, as when it protects a horse from a mob by soldiers, or appropriates private property to public use, or harms man in pursuance of a judicial sentence, or whether it brings them about immediately through man's affairs, its object is equally an external result. In directing itself against robbery or murder, for instance, its purpose is to put a stop to the actual physical taking and keeping of other men's goods, or the actual poisoning, shooting, stabbing, and otherwise putting to death of other men. Although things are not done, the law forbidding them is equally satisfied, whatever the motive. Considering this purely external purpose of the law, together with the fact that it is ready to sacrifice individuals so far as necessary in order to accomplish that purpose, we can see more readily than before that the actual degree of personal guilt involved in any particular transgression cannot be the only element, if it is an element at all, in the liability incurred. So far from its being true, it is often assumed that the condition of a man's heart or conscience ought to be more considered in determining criminal than civil liability. It might also be said that it is a very opposite truth. For civil liability, its immediate working is simply a redistribution of existing laws between two individuals. It will be argued in the next lecture that a sound policy lets losses lie where they fall, except where a special reason can be shown for interference. The most frequent of such reasons is that the party who is charged has been to blame. It is not intended to deny that criminal liability as well as civil is founded on blameworthiness. Such a denial would shock the moral sense of any civilized community. Or, to put it another way, a law which punished conduct which would not be blameworthy in the average member of the community would be too severe for that community to bear. It's only intended to point out that when we are dealing with that part of the law which aims more directly than any other at establishing standards of conduct, we should expect there more than elsewhere to find that the test for liability are external and independent degree of evil in the particular person's motives or intentions. The conclusion follows directly from the nature of the stand to which conformity is required. These are not only external, as was shown above, but they are for general application. They do not merely require that every man should get as near as he can to the best conduct possible for him. They require him at his own peril to come up to a certain height. They take no account for incapacities, unless weakness is so marked as to fall into well-known exceptions, such as infancy or madness. They assume that every man is as able as every other to be here at the command. If they fall on any one class harder than on another, it is on the weakness. It is on the weakest. It is precisely those who are most likely to err by temperament, ignorance, and folly that threat the law are the most dangerous. The reconciliation of the doctrine that liability is founded on blameworthiness with the existence of liability where the parties not to blame will be worked out more fully in the next lecture. It is found in the conception of the average man, the matter for ordinary intelligence and reasonable prudence. Liability is said to arise out of such conduct as would be blameworthy in him, but is an ideal being represented by the jury when they are appealed to, and his conduct is external or objective standard when applied to any given individual. That individual may be morally without standing because he has less than ordinary intelligence or prudence, but he is required to have those qualities and his peril. If he has them, he will not, as a general rule, incur liability without blameworthiness. The next step is to take up some crimes in detail and to discover what analysis will teach with regard to them. I will begin with murder. Murder is defined by Sir James Stephen in the Digest of Criminal Law as unlawful homicide with a malice of forethought. In his early work, he explained that malice meant wickedness, and the law had determined what the states of mind were wicked in the necessary degree. Without the same preliminary, he continues in his digest as follows. Malice of forethought means any one or more of the following states of mind. A. Intention to cause the death of or grievous bodily harm to any person, whether such a person is the person actually killed or not. B. Knowledge that the act which causes death will probably cause the death of or grievous bodily harm to some person, whether such a person is the person actually killed or not. Although such knowledge is accompanied by indifference, whether death or grievous bodily harm is caused or not, or by a wish that it may not be caused. C. An intent to commit any felony, whatever. D. An intent to oppose by force any officer of justice on his way to, in, or returning from the execution of the duty of arresting, keeping in custody, or imprisoning any person whom he is lawfully entitled to arrest, keep in custody, or imprison, or the duty of keeping the peace or dispersing an unlawful assembly, provided that the offender has noticed that the person killed is such an officer so employed. Malice, as used in common speech, includes intent with something more. When an act is said to be done with intent to do harm, it meant that a wish for the harm is the motive of the act. Intent, however, is perfectly consistent with the harm being regretted as such as being wished only as a means to something else. But when an act is said to have done maliciously, it meant not only that a wish for the harmful effect is the motive, but also that the harm is a wish for its own sake, or as Austin would say with more accuracy, for the sake of the pleasurable feeling which knowledge of the suffering caused by the act would excite. But it is apparent from Sir James Stephen's enumeration that of these two elements for malice, the intent alone is a material to murder. It is as much murder to shoot a sentry for the purposes of releasing a friend as to shoot him because you hate him. Malice in the definition of murder has not the same meaning as in common speech, or in view of the considerations just mentioned, it has been sought to mean criminal intention. But the intent again will be found to resolve itself into two things: foresight, that certain consequences will follow from an act, and the wish for those consequences working as a motive which induces the act. The question then is whether intent in its term cannot be reduced to a law of term. Sir James Stephen's statement shows that it can be, and that knowledge that the act will probably cause death, that is, foresight of the consequences of the act, is enough in murder as in tort. For instance, a newly born child is laid naked out of doors, where it must perish as a matter of course. This is none the less murder that the guilty party would have been very glad to have a stranger found the child deceived. But again, what is the foresight of consequences? It's a picture of a future state of things caught up by knowledge of the present state of things, the future being viewed as standing to the present in the relation of effect to cause. Again, we must seek a reduction to lower terms. If the known present state of things, such as the act done, will very certainly cause death, and the probability is a matter of common knowledge, one who does the act knowing the present state of things is guilty of murder, and the law will not inquire whether he did actually foresee the consequences or not. The test of foresight is not what this word criminal foresaw, but what a man of reasonable prudence would have foreseen. On the other hand, there must be actual present knowledge of the present facts which make an act dangerous. The act is not enough by itself. An act is true, imports intention in a certain sense. It is a muscular contraction and something more. A spasm is not an act. The contraction of the muscles must be willed. And as the adult, who is a master of himself, foresees with mysterious accuracy the outward adjustment which will follow his inward effort, that adjustment may be said to be intended. But the intent necessarily accompanying the act ends there. Nothing would follow from the act except for the environment. All acts taken apart from their surrounding circumstances are indifferent to the law. For instance, to croak the forefinger with a certain force is the same act whether the trigger of a pistol is next to it or not. It is only the surrounding circumstances of a pistol loaded, crooked, and cocked, and of a human being in such relation to it as to be manifestly likely to hit, that makes the act wrong. Hence, it is so sufficiently foundation. It is no sufficient foundation for liability on any sound principle that is a proximate cause of loss was the act. The reason for requiring an act is that an act implies a choice, and if it felt to be impolitic and unjust to make a man answerable for harm, unless he might have chosen otherwise, but the choice might be made with a chance for contemplating the consequence complained of, or else it has no bearing on responsibility for that consequence. If this were not true, a man might be held answerable for everything which would not have happened but for his choice at some past time. For instance, for having a feat fallen on a man, which he would not have done had he not chosen to come to the city where he was taken ill. All foresight is the future. All choices with regard to any possible consequence of action depends on what is known at the moment of choosing. An act cannot be wrong, even when done under circumstances in which it will be hurtful, unless those circumstances are or not to be known. A fear punishment for causing harm cannot work as a motive, unless the possibility of harm may be foreseen. So far, then, as a criminal liability is founded upon wrongdoing in any sense, or as far as the threat of the punishment of the law I intend to deter a man from bringing about various harmful results, he must be confined to cases where circumstances making the conduct dangerous were known. Still, in a more limited way, the same principle applies to knowledge that applies to foresight. It is enough that such circumstances were actually known as would have led a man of a common understanding to infer from them the rest of the group making up the present state of things. For instance, if a workman on a housetop at midday knows that the space below him is a street in a great city, he knows facts from which a man common understanding would infer that there were people passing below. He is therefore bound to draw that inference, or in other words, is chargeable with knowledge of that fact also, whether he draws inference or not. If then he throws down a heavy beam into the street, he does an act which a person of ordinary prudence would foresee is likely to cause death, or grievous bodily harm. It is dealt with as if he foresaw it, whether he does so in fact or not. If death is caused by the act, it is good to murder. But if the workman has reasonable cause to believe that the space below is a private yard from which everyone is excluded, which is used as a rubbish heap, his act is not blameworthy, and the homicide is a mere misadventure. To make act which causes death murder, then the actor ought, on principle, to know or have notice of the facts which make the act dangerous. There are certain exceptions to this principle which will be stated presently, but they have less application to murder than to other smaller statutory crimes. The general rule prevails for the most part in murder. But furthermore, on the same principle, the danger which in fact exists under the known circumstances ought to be of a class which a man of reasonable prudence could foresee. Ignorance of a fact and inability to foresee a consequence have the same effect on blameworthiness. If the consequence cannot be foreseen, it cannot be avoided. But there is this practical difference that whereas in most cases the question of knowledge is a question of the actual condition of the defendant's consciousness, the question of what he might have foreseen is determined by the standards of prudent man, that is, by general experience. What is to be remembered that the object of the law is to prevent human life being endangered or taken, and that although it is so far considered blameworthiness in punishing as not to hold man responsible for consequences which no one, or only some exceptional specialists, could have foreseen, still the reason for this limitation is simply to make a rule which is not too hard for the average member of the community, as a purpose to compel men to abstain from a dangerous conduct, and not merely to restrain them from an evil inclination. The law requires them, and the peril, to know the teachings of common experience, just as it requires them to know the law. Subject to these explanations, it may be said that the test of murder is a degree of danger to life attending the act under the known circumstances of the case. In no further explanation to show that when the particular defendant does for any reason, foresee what an ordinary man of reasonable prudence would not have foreseen, the ground of exemption no longer applies. A harmful act is only excused on the ground that the party neither did foresee, nor could with proper care have foreseen harm. It would seem at the first sight that the above analysis ought to exhaust the whole subject of murder, but it does not without some further explanation. If a man forcibly resists an officer lawfully making an arrest and kills him, knowing him to be an officer, it may be murder, although no act is done which, for his official function, would be criminal at all. So if a man does act with intent to commit a felony, and thereby accidentally kills another, for instance, if he fires at chickens, intending to steal them, and accidentally kills the owner, which he does not see, such a case as this last seems harder to be reconcilable with the general principles which have been laid down. It has been argued somewhat as follows. The only blameworthy act is firing at the chickens, knowing them to belong to another. It's neither more or less so because an incident happened afterwards, and the hitting a man whose presence could not have been suspected is an accident. The fact that the shooting is a felony does not make it any more likely to kill people. If the object of the rule is to prevent such accidents, it should make accidental killing with firearms murder, not accidental killing in the effort to steal. Well, if the object, if its object is to prevent the stealing, it would do better to hang one thief in every thousand by lot. Still, the law is intelligible as it stands. The general test of murder is a degree of danger intending the act under the known state of facts. If certain acts are regarded as particularly dangerous under certain circumstances, a legislator may make them punishable if done under these circumstances. Although the danger was not generally known, the law often takes this step, although it does not nowadays then inflict death in such cases. It sometimes goes even further and requires men to find out present fact as well as to foresee future harm and its peril, although they are not such as would necessarily be inferred from the facts known. Thus, it is a statutory offense in England to abduct a girl under 16 from the possession of the person having lawful charge of her. If a man does act which induce a girl under 16 to leave her parents, he is not chargeable. If he had no reason to know that she was under the lawful charge of her parents, and if it may be presumed that he would not be, if he had reasonable cause to believe that she was a boy. But if he knowingly adopts a girl from her parents, he must find out her age and his peril. It is no defense that he had every person think her over 16. So under a prohibitory liquor law, it has been held that if a man tells plantation beaters, it is no defense that he does not know them to be intoxicating. And there are other examples of the same kind. Now, if experience shows or is deemed by the lawmaker to show that somehow or other deaths which the evidence make accidental happen disproportionately often in connection with other felonies, or with resistance to the officers, or if on any other ground of policy it is deemed desirable to make special efforts for the prevention of such deaths, the lawmaker may consistently treat acts which under the known circumstances are felonies or constitute resistance to officer as having a sufficiently dangerous tendency to be put under a special ban. The law may therefore throw on the actor the peril not only of the consequences foreseen by him, but also of consequences which, although not predicted by common experience, the legislator apprehends. I do not, however, mean to argue that the rules under discussion arose on the above reasoning any more than they are right or would be generally applied in this country. Returning to the main line of thought, it will be instructive to consider the relation of manslaughter to murder. One great difference between the two will be found to lie in the degree of danger attaching to the act in the given state of facts. If a man strikes another with a small stick, which is not likely to kill, which he has no reason to suppose will do more than slight bodily harm, but which does kill the other, he commits manslaughter. Manslaughter, not murder. But if the blow is struck as hard as possible with an iron bar, an inch thick, it's murder. So if at the time of striking with a switch, the party knows additional fact, by reason of which he foresees that death will be the consequence of a slight blow, or for instance that the other has heart disease, the offense is equally murder. To explode a barrel of gunpowder in a crowded streets and kill people is a murder, although the actor hopes that no such harm will be done. But to kill a man by careless riding the same street would commonly be manslaughter. Perhaps, however, a case would be put where the riding is so manifestly dangerous that it would be murder. recur to an example which has been used already for another purpose when a workman fling down a stone or piece of timber into the street and kills a man. This may be either misadventure, manslaughter, or murder, according to the circumstances under which the original act was done. If it were in a country village where few passengers are, and it called out to all people to have a care, it is a misadventure only. But if it were in London or other populous town where people are continuously passing, it is a manslaughter, although he gives loud warning, and murder if he knows of their passing and gives no warning at all. The lawful manslaughter contains another doctrine which should be referred to in order to complete the understanding of the general principles of the criminal law. This doctrine is that a provocation may reduce an offense which would otherwise have been murder to manslaughter. According to the current morality, a man is not so much to blame for the act done under the disturbance of great excitement caused by a wrong done to himself as when he is calm. The law is made to govern men through their motives, and they must therefore take their mental constitution into account. It might be argued, on the other hand, that if the object of punishment is a prevention, the heaviest punishment should be threatened where the stronger the motive is needed to restrain, and the preventive legislation seems sometimes to have gone on that principle. But if any threat will restrain a man in a passion, a threat of less than death will be sufficient, and therefore the extreme penalty has been thought excessive. At the same time, the object nature of legal standards is shown even here. The mitigation does not come from the fact that the defendant is beside himself with rage. It is not enough that he had grounds which would have had the same effect on every man of his standing and education. The most insulting words are not provocation. Although to this day, and still more, when the law was established, many people would rather die than suffer them without action. There must be provocation sufficient to justify the passion, and the law decide on general considerations whether provocations are sufficient. It said to even what the law admits to be provocation does not extenuate the guilt of a homicide, unless the person provoked is at a time when he does the deeds deprived of the power of self-control by the provocation which he has received. There are always reasons for taking the actual state of the defendant's consciousness into account to this extent. The only ground for not applying the general law is that the defendant was in such a state that could not be expected to remember or be influenced by the fear of punishment. If he couldn't be, the ground for exception disappears. Yet even here, rightly or wrongly, the law has gone far in the direction of adopting external tests. The courts seem to have decided between murder and manslaughter on such grounds as the nature of the weapon used, or the length of time between the provocation and the act. But in other cases, the question whether the prisoner was deprived of self-control by passion has been left to the jury. The object of this lecture is not to give an outline of the criminal law, but to explain its general theory. I shall only consider such offences through some special light upon the subject, and shall treat of those in such order as seem best fitted for that purpose. It will now be used for take up malicious mischief, and to compare the malice required constitute the offense, with the malice of forethought of murder. The charge of malice of forethought is an indictment for murder, has been shown not to mean a state of the defendant's mind, and is often sought except in the sense that he knew circumstances which did, in fact, make his conduct dangerous. It is in truth an allegation like that negligence which asserts that the party accused did not come up to the legal standard of action under circumstances in which he found himself, also that there was no exceptional fact or excuse present which took the case out of the general rule. It is a wordment of the a conclusion of law which is permitted to abridge the fact, positive and negative, on which it is founded. When the statute punishes willfully and maliciously injuring another the property, it's arguable, if not clear, that something more is met. The presumption that the second word was not ended without some meaning is seconded by the unreasonableness of making every willful trespass criminal. If this reasoning prevails, maliciously is here used in the popular sense, and imports that the motive for the defendant's act was a wish to harm the owner of the property, all the thing itself, if living, as the end and for the sake of the harm. Malice in this sense has nothing in common with the malice of murder. Statutory law need not profess to be consistent with itself, or with the theory adopted by judicial decisions. Hence, there is strictly no need to reconcile such a statute with the principles which have been explained. But there is no inconsistency, although punishment must be confined to compelling external conformity to the rule of conduct, so far as that is can always be avoided, by avoiding or doing certain acts as required, with whatever intent or for whatever motive. Still, the prohibited conduct may not be hurtful unless it is accompanied by a particular state of feeling. Common disputes about the property are satisfactorily settled by compensation, but everyone knows that sometimes secret harm is done by neighbor to neighbor with artful pure malice and spite. The damage can be paid for, but the malignity call for revenge, and difficulty of detecting the authors of such wrongs, which are always done secretly, affords ground for punishment, even if revenge is sought insufficient. How far the law will go in this direction is hard to say. The crime of arson is defined to be the malicious and willful burning of the house of another man. It is generally discussed in close connection with a malicious mischief. Has been thought that the burning was not malicious where a prisoner set fire to his prison, not from a desire to consume the building, but solely to effect his escape. But it seems to be the better opinion that this is arson. This is arson, in which case an intentional burn is malicious within the meaning of the rule. When we remember that arson was a subject to one's of the old appeals, would take us far back into the early law, we may readily understand that the unintentional burnings were redressed in that way. The appeal for arson was brother to the appeal de passe et palages. The latter was founded on a warlike assault. The former supposed a house firing for robbery or revenge, such as that by which Nigel perished in the Icelandic saga. But this crime seems to have had the same history as others. As well as intent is admitted to be sufficient, the law is on the high road to the external standard. A man who intentionally sets fire to his own horse, which is so near to other horses that the fire will manifestly endanger them, is guilty of arson if one of the other horses is burned in consequence. In this case, act which would not have been arson, taking only its immediate consequences into account, becomes arson by reason of more remote consequences which were manifestly likely to follow, whether they were actually intended or not. If that may be the effect of setting fire to things which a man has a right to burn, so far as they alone are concerned, why, on principle, should it not be the effect of any other act which is equally likely under the surrounding circumstances to cause the same harm? Cases may easily be imagined where firing a gun, or making a chemical mixture, or piling up oil rags, or 20 other things might be manifestly dangerous in this highest degree and actually lead to a conflagration. If in such cases a crime is held to have been committed, external standard is reached, and the analysis which have been made of murder applies here. It is another class of cases in which intent plays an important part for quite different reasons from those which have been offered to account for the law of malicious mischief. The most obvious examples of this class are criminal attempts. Attempt and intent, of course, are two distinct things. Intent to commit a crime is not itself criminal. The law against a man's intending to commit a murder the day before tomorrow. The law only deals with the conduct. Attempt is a overt act. It differs from the attempted crime in this. That act has failed to bring about the result which would have given it the character of the principal crime. If attempted murder results in death within a year and a day, it is a murder. If attempted still results in carrying off the owner's goods, it's a larceny. If act is done of which the natural and probable effect on the circumstances is the accomplishment of a substantive crime, the criminal law, which it may properly enough moderate the severity of punishment if the act has none that effect in the particular case, can hardly abstain altogether from punishing it. On one theory, it has been argued that the actual intent is all that can give the act a criminal character in such instances. But if the views which I have advanced as to murder and manslaughter are sound, the same principle ought logically determine the criminality of acts in general, as should be judged by their tendency under the known circumstances, not by the actual intent which accompany them. It may be true that in region of attempts, as elsewhere, the law begins with cases of actual intent, as those cases are the most obvious ones. But it cannot stop with them unless it attaches more importance to the etymological meaning of the word attempted than to the general principles of punishment. Accordingly, there is a less colorful authority for the proposition that an act is punishable as attempt if supposing it to have produced its natural and probable effect. It would have amounted to a substantive crime. But such acts are not the only punishable attempts. There is another class in which actual intent is clearly necessary, and the existence of this class, as well as the name attempt, no doubt tends to affect the whole doctrine. Some acts may be attempted for or misdemeanors which could not have effected the crime unless followed by the other acts on the part of the wrongdoer. For instance, lighting a match with the intent to set fire to a haystack has not been held to amount to a criminal attempt to burn it. Although the defendant blew out the match unseen that he was watched. So the purchase the dies for making counterfeit coin is a misdemeanor, although of course a coin would not be counterfeited unless the dies were used. In such a case, the law goes on to a new principle, different from that governing most substantive crimes. The reason for punishing any act must generally to be prevented some harm, which is foreseen as likely to follow that act, under circumstances in which it is done. In most substantive crimes, the ground on which the likelihood stands is the common working of the natural causes as shown by experience. But when an act is punished, the natural effect of which is not harmful under the circumstances, then the ground alone will not suffice. The probability does not exist unless there are grounds for expecting that the act done will be followed by other acts in connection with which its effect will be harmful, although not so otherwise. But as in fact no such acts have followed, it cannot in general be assumed from the mere doing of what has been done that it would have followed if the actor has not been interrupted, would not have followed it unless the actor has chosen. The only way generally available to show that he would have chosen to do them is by showing that he intended to do them when he did what he did. The accompanying intent in that case renders the otherwise innocent act harmful, because it raises the probability that it will not be followed by such other acts or events and events as will altogether result in harm. The importance of the intent is not to show that the act was wicked, but to show that it was likely to be followed by hurtful consequences. It will be readily seen that there are limits to this kind of liability. The law does not punish every act which is done with the intent to bring about the crime. If a man starts from Boston to Cambridge for the purpose of committing a murder when he gets there, but is stopped by the jaw and goes home, he is no more punishable than if he had sat in his chair and resolved to shoot somebody, but on second thought they give up the notion. On second thought, had given up the notion. On the other hand, the slave who ran after a white woman, but detested from before he caught her, has been convicted for attempt to commit rape. We have seen what amounts to attempt to burn a hailstake. But it said that in the same case, that if the defendant had gone no further than to buy a box of matches for the purpose, it would not have been liable. Eminent judges have been puzzled where to draw the line, or even to state the principle on which it should be drawn between the two sets of cases. But the principle is believed to be similar to that on which all other lines are drawn by the law. Public policy, that is to say, legislative considerations, at the bottom of the matter, the considerations being, in this case, the nearness of the danger, the greatness of the harm, and the degree of apprehension felt. When a man buys match to fire a hailstake, or starts on a journey meaning to murder at the end of it, there is still a considerable chance that he will change his mind before he comes to the point. But when he has struck the match, or cocked and aimed the pistol, there is very little chance that he will not persist to the end, and the danger becomes so great that the law steps in. With the object which could not be used innocently, the point of intervention might be put further back, as in the case of the purchase of a die for coining. The degree of apprehension may affect decision as well as the degree of probability that the crime will be accomplished. No doubt the fears particular to a slave-owning community have their share in the conviction which has just been mentioned. There is one doubtful point which should not be passed over. It has been thought that to shoot at the block of wood, thinking it to be a man, is not attempted murder, and that to put a hand into an empty pocket, intending to pick it, is not attempt to commit larceny. Although on the latter question there is a difference for pity. The reason given is that an act which could not have been effected the crime, if the actor has been allowed to follow it up to all results to which, in the nature of things, it could have led, cannot be attempt to commit that crime when interrupted. And at some point or other, of course, the law must adopt this conclusion, unless it goes on the theory of retribution for guilt and not of prevention of harm. But even to prevent harm effectually, it will not do to be too exact. I do not suppose that firing a pistol at a man with intent to kill him is any the less attempted murder because the bullet misses its aim. Yet the act has produced the whole effect possible to it in the course of nature. It is just as impossible that the bullet under those circumstances should hit that man as to pick an empty pocket. But there is no difficulty in saying that such act under such circumstances is so dangerous, so far as the possibility of human foresight is concerned, that it should be punished. No one can absolutely know, though many would be pretty sure exactly where the bullet will strike, and if the harm is done. It is a very great harm. If a man fires at a block, no harm can possibly ensue, and no theft can be committed in an empty pocket. Besides that, the harm of successful theft is less than that of murder. Yet it might be said that even such things and these should be punished in order to make discouragement broad enough and easy to understand. There remain to be considered certain substantive crimes which differ in very important ways from murder and the like, and for the explanation which the foregoing analysis of intent in criminal attempts and the analogous misdemeanors will be found of service. The type this is a larceny. Under this name, acts are punished which of themselves would not be sufficient to accomplish the evil which the law seeks to prevent, and which are treated as equally criminal, whether the evil has been accomplished or not. Murder, manslaughter, and arson, on the other hand, are not committed unless the evil is accomplished. And they all consist of acts, the tendency of which, under surrounding circumstances, is to hurt or destroy person or property by the mere working of natural laws. In larceny, the consequences immediately following from the act are generally exhausted with little or no harm to the owner. Goods are removed from his possession by trespass, and that is all, when the crime is complete. But they must be permanently kept from him before the harm is done, which the law seeks to prevent. A monetary loss of possession is not what has been guarded against with such severe penalties. What the law meant to prevent is a loss of it wholly and forever, and is shown by the fact that it is not larceny to take for a contemporary use without intending to deprive the owner of the property. If then the law punishes the mere act of taking, it punishes the act which will not of itself produce the evil effect or sought to be prevented, and punishes it before that effect has in any way come to pass. The reason is plain enough. The law cannot wait until the property has been used up or destroyed in other hands than the owner's, or until the owner has died, in order to make sure that the harm which it seeks to prevent has been done. As for the same reason, it cannot confine itself to acts likely to do that harm, for the harm of permanent loss of property will not be followed from the act of taking, but only from the series of acts which constitute the removing and keeping the property after it has been taken. Of this preliminaries, the bearing of intent upon the crime is easily seen. According to Mr. Bishop, larceny is the taking and the removing by trespass of personal property which the trespasser knows to belong either generally or specially to another, with the intent to deprive such owner of his ownership therein, and purpose should be added for the sake of some advantage to the trespasser, a proposition on which the decisions are not harmonious. There must be an intent to deprive such owner of his ownership therein, it is said. But why? Is it because the law is more anxious not to put a man in prison for stealing unless he is actually wicked, that is, not to harm him for killing another? That can hardly be. The true answer is that the intent is an index to the external event which probably would have happened, and that if the law is to punish at all, it must, in this case, go on probabilities, not on accomplished facts. The analogy to the manner of dealing with attempts is plain. Theft must be called attempt to permanently deprive a man of his property, which is punished with the same severity whether successful or not. If theft can rightly be considered in this way, intent must play the same part as in other attempts. An act which does not fully accomplish the prohibited result may be made wrongful by evidence that but for some interference it would have been followed by other acts coordinated with it to produce that result. This can only be shown by showing intent. In theft, the intent to deprive the owner of his property establishes that the theft would have retained or would not have taken steps to restore the stolen goods. Nor would it matter that the thief afterwards changed his mind and returned the goods. From the point of view of attempt, the crime was already complete when the property was carried off. It may be object to this view that if intent is only A makeshift which from a practical necessity takes the place of actual deprivation ought not to be required where the actual deprivation is wholly accomplished, provided the same criminal act produce a whole effect. Suppose, for instance, that by one the same motion a man seizes and backs another horse over a precipice. The whole evil which the law seeks to prevent is a natural and manifestly certain consequence of the act under the known circumstances. In such a case, if the law for larceny is consistent with the theories here maintained, the act should be passed upon according to its tendency, and the actual intent of the wrongdoer not in any way considered. Yet it is possible to see the list that even in such case the intent would make all the difference. Assume that if the act was without excuse and wrongful, and that it would have amounted to larceny if done for the purpose of depriving the owner of his horse. Nevertheless, if it was done for the sake of experiment, without actual foresight at destruction or evil design against the owner, the trespasser might not be held a thief. The inconsistency, if there is one, seems to be explained by the way in which the law has grown. The distinctions of the common law as to theft are not those of a broad theory of legislation. They are highly technical and were largely dependent upon history for explanation. The type of theft is taking to one's own user. It used to be, and sometimes still is, so that the taking must be la cry cadesa, for the sake of some advantage to the thief. In such cases, the owner is deprived of his property by the thief's keeping it, not by its destruction, and the permanence of his loss can only be judged of beforehand by the intent to keep. The intent is therefore always necessary and is naturally stated in the form of a self-regarding intent, with at once on the whole precedents which were decided that the intent to deprive the owner of his property was sufficient. As late as 1815, the English judges stood only 6-5 in favor of the proposition that it was larceny to take a horse intended to kill it for no other purpose than to destroy evidence against a friend. Even that case, however, did not do away with the universality of intent as a test, for the destruction followed the taking. It is an ancient rule that the criminality of the act must be determined by the state of things at the time of the taking, and not afterwards. Whether the law of larceny would follow what is seen to be the general principle of criminal law, or would be held back by tradition, can only be decided by a case like that supposed above, where the same act accomplishes both taking and destruction. As have been suggested already, tradition might were possibly prevail. Another crime in which the particularities noticed in larceny are still more clearly marked and at the same time more easily explained is burglary. It is defined as breaking and entering any dwelling house by night with intent to commit a felony therein. The object of punishing such a breaking and entering is not to prevent trespass even when committed by night, but only such trespasses are the first step to wrongs of a greater magnitude, like robbery or murder. In this case, the function of intent, when proved, appeared more clearly than in theft, but is precisely similar. It is indexed to the probability of certain future acts which the law seeks to prevent. And here the law gives evidence that it is a true explanation, for if the apprehended act did follow, which it is no longer necessary to allege that the breaking and entering was without intent. An indictment for burglary, which charges that the defendant broke into a dwelling house and stole certain properties, is as good as one which alleges that he broke in with intent to steal. It's believed that enough has now been said to explain the general theory of criminal liability as it stands at the common law. The result may be summed up as follows: all acts are indifferent per se. in the characteristic title for substantive crime acts are rendered criminal because they are done under circumstances in which they will probably cause some harm which the law seeks to prevent. The test of criminality in such cases is the degree of danger shown by experience to attend an act under those circumstances. In such cases, the man's error, or actual wickedness of the party is wholly unnecessary, and all reference to the state of his consciousness is misleading. It means anything more than that the circumstances in connection with which the tendency of the act is judged are the circumstances known to him. Even the requirement knowledge is subject to certain limitations. A man must find out as a peril things which a reasonable and prudent man would have inferred from the things actually known. In some cases, especially for statutory crimes, he must go even further when he knows certain facts, must find out as a peril whether the other facts are present when would make the act criminal. A man who abducts a girl from her parents in England must find out at his peril whether she is under 16. In some cases, it may be that the consequence of the act under the circumstances must be actually foreseen. If it is a consequence which a prudent man would not have foreseen, the reference to the prudent man as a standard is the only form in which blameworthiness as such is an element of crime, and what would be blameworthy in such a man is an element, first, as a swallow feature of a true moral standard, second, because to punish what would not be blameworthy in an average member of the community would be to enforce a standard which was indefensible theoretically, and which practically was too high for that community. In some cases, actual malice or intent in the common meaning of those words is an element in crime. But it will be found that when it is so, it is because the act, when done maliciously, is followed by harm which would not have followed that act alone, or because intent raises a strong probability that an act, innocent in itself, will be followed by other acts or events in connection with which it will accomplish the result sought to be prevented by the law. That's the end of lecture 2.